So in terms of kind of the tensions between protesters, is this normal? Is this something you expect to see when we've got protests of this magnitude going on?
Yeah, I mean, we have sort of as our historical parallels things that happened in the 60s. And the difference in the 1960s is there was sort of an organized leadership that tried to not only articulate what the goal of the movement was, but also what the tactics should be. This is much more decentralized, and all social movements and social protest phenomena are always complex. There's always a lot of players. There are people that are agent provocateurs. There are people that are just there for a good fight. So there's always a lot going on in these situations. But added to that is the decentralized nature of protest now, that is sort of facilitated by social media more than a charismatic leader, a Martin Luther King, if you will. And so there is a lot of competing ideas about what the end game is and what the tactics should be. And there are also people from the outside who aren't really involved in the actual issues of the protest, but are brought to the fray by the excitement, by the fact that it's thrilling to be in the streets, and especially if you're a young person raging against authority, it's kind of the place to be. And so you kind of want the tear gas canisters to go off, because it adds to the us versus them story that is what brought you to the fight in the first place.
Is it helpful or unhelpful to have, people who are purportedly on the same side of an issue fighting amongst themselves?
Well, I think it's the nature of protests, that they are complex phenomena, and you're going to have different voices, and you're going to have people who are kind of frustrated to the breaking point where they think that violence is their only solution. And you also have people that kind of have the long-term goals, that think, the presence in the street is the way to achieve the goal, not the destruction of property. But if we go back again to the 1960s, if you think about the civil rights movement kind of coalescing around two figures, Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, there was a lot of mainstream people who weren't very interested in Martin Luther King Jr. at all, until they saw Malcolm X, until they saw the more radical option that, by any means necessary, we're going to achieve this goal. All of a sudden, those people took a second look at Martin Luther King and started to embrace his nonviolent tactics. So there's also a functional element of the more extreme element to push the narrative of the nonviolent folks to the front. And, of course, there's also this blowback that there may be damage done to the movement because of the images that people think of, the pulling down of statues, or the smashing of store windows, or the spray painting of, profanities about the police. And so there's a lot going on. And I think the danger that we have is sort of simplifying this complex phenomena. There's just so many moving parts to any type of protest. That there's sort of a lot to take apart, but we sort of focus on the most dramatic image. But in fact, those really dramatic images can draw people to the more peaceful images and move the ball forward.
You touched on this a little bit when you said how, like, the internet and social media have made it a more decentralized protest. Are there any other ways in which social media have played a role that's unique during this round of protests?
Well, one of the things about social media, it's sort of like electricity. You can use it to light the room, or you can use it to electrocute someone to death. You've got sort of these positive flows of information that connect people who are feeling very marginalized and alone, and feel traumatized, and feel that their voice isn't heard. All of a sudden, they have this voice. So it's helped to empower people who are often on the sidelines to say, hey, this thing's going on, and it speaks to something that's important to me, and I'm going to engage in it, whether it's in the street or just posting an image on their Facebook page. But it also spreads false information. I mean, the other side of it is just we have so much misinformation, including about Antifa or about the police, or, there's all this sort of bad information that really has to be sorted out. So, you take the good with the bad, but there's a lot of both when it comes to social media.
Looking specifically at one of the larger nonviolent groups, Rose City Justice, it seems like it's been a few days now since they've had any protests. They sort of went inactive amid some of the internet
My
fighting.
5-year-old wants to go to a demonstration, and I'm like, oh, I think they canceled today's kid. I'm sorry, you're gonna have to wait.
Right. And since that was a group that was attracting, upwards of thousands of people, many of them people who aren't likely to go to Justice Center protests, like parents and grandparents with young children. Do you see that as detrimental to the movement, or do you think another group might come and fill in that void if Rose City Justice doesn't bounce back?
Right. It's hard to predict the future at all in 2020. I've just sort of given up on that in general. But what we know is that these protest movements have had real effects. They've had impacts on policy. We've seen the police chief resign. We've seen reform around the country. And so the initial thing that brought people to the movement, some of that has actually been accomplished in an amazingly short period of time. We also know that the opening up of the economy has also sort of pulled people away. I mean, there's this perfect storm between the lockdown and the George Floyd killing, and the things that had been simmering up underneath the economy tanking that really sort of helped motivate people because they were stuck at home, in front of their computers watching all these things, and now they have some other alternatives to take their attention away. So these things tend to have ebbs and flows, and I think we're kind of in a little bit of a down cycle, but it's always possible for things to ramp up. And I think the most obvious thing is as we move closer to the election, the rhetoric will be more intense. There will be more incidents, and so we'll probably see the summer kind of have its own life in terms of the protest movement. It certainly isn't going away because it was always there. The Black Lives Matter movement has been active since 2016, and we have seen it have sort of moments where it's really out in front and behind the scenes. And I think we're seeing a lot of that work being done behind the scenes now, and including encouraging mainstream America to have honest conversations about the issue of race and racism. And so it just moved into a different phase of its evolution.
So we can expect then to see more of this as the summer goes on, and like you said, as we get closer to November.
Right. I would think so. And I would think there will be other incidents like the George Floyd incident. There will be things that sort of draw people in, including the fact that we're not done with COVID, and there may be other lockdowns that push people back in front of their laptops, in front of their TVs, kind of tying into the bigger media picture. And so we just sort of have to wait and see which way it's going to go.
It sounds like you expect as things open up more people might get drawn away from the protests, who might just be there less on principle and more on this is a way to get out and have some excitement during closure.
Well, yeah, but also that people aren't working, and people, have the time, and people are also all sort of consuming a certain amount of media diet, whether it's, on Twitter or whatever platform they're on. And so there was a lot of people that watched the George Floyd killing that might not have watched it a year ago because they were at work or they were out at the bar with their friends. It provided this opportunity to both tie into what's happening in the world, but also for people to have a conversation, to reflect, well, how does this impact me? What does this say about me? And so it was a wonderful, strange moment like we've never had before, where people were both more plugged into the external, but also had the opportunity to be more reflective because they weren't at work and they weren't hanging out in their normal settings. And so I think a lot of that provided the platform for people to sort of hit the streets. I just think the big theme is the complexity of these phenomena, and it's just so easy to get pulled into the most dramatic images when in fact the majority of these protests have been peaceful and have been attended by family members and children and have not been hostile to the police in the way that the Justice Center events have. And and I think there's also a psychology of these types of groups that makes it very exciting. When I was down there observing, you get pulled into the excitement of the us versus them feeling, and of course that works against the purpose of actually breaking the barriers down, including finding commonality with law enforcement and law enforcement who are reformers and law enforcement who, agree with the belief that George Floyd was murdered. And, the people who are sort of on our side, we become very binary in this us versus them. And I think the left is as good at doing this as the right. And we're working, now we have an opportunity to work back towards those common purposes.